Thank you. It's really great to be here. Thanks so much. You know, it's funny when you apply for these positions, like the dean position, you don't really get to talk about your research. It's kind of a funny thing. Like, you know, I'm in this because I love, I love the administration, but I love the research. It's what got me going to begin with. And so I'm super excited to be able to talk to you and then continue these conversations across campus. It's also so funny. We're just saying, I've got all these parts of my life represented here. You know, Ben is a senior this year. I knew this guy from Fort Collins back when I was there years ago. Luli from State College. Like, this is kind of fun. ESF. So it's really a homecoming in so many ways. So thanks so much. This concept of unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. It's what underlies parks and protected areas, right? This is the balance. And I really think it's also one of those balances that we think about when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about the concept of how do we actually exist in spaces without destroying them over time, right? And that's the big question. And you know, the reason I have that is, you'll see, this is on the way up to Denali, where we've done quite a bit of work. There's this pullout where you have the first glimpse of Denali, and it says unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations, right from the Organic Act of 1916, which for me really defines that balance all the time. And it's kind of one of those balances that's almost impossible to maintain, right? This concept of unimpairment, and thinking about this concept of enjoyment, it brings in people, its values, it's all these different pieces all at once. And it's almost like the mission question that we all have, right? In Rubenstein, it's like, how do we do this? It's a challenge to us. I got my start in this when I was an undergrad, and this was me with hair in 1992, sophomore in college, and someone said, hey, Student Conservation Association, students, if you're interested in that or you know of it, it's an amazing organization, places students all over the country in parks and protected areas and forests. I was in Idaho, and it was my first introduction to, you know, wildfire, because it was in a big place that in the Frank Church Wilderness, you know, returned big areas, big fires. I was, you know, helping smoke jumpers would come in, we hike out, help them pull their equipment, and we did search and rescue. It was this eye-opening experience that said, I love wilderness, and I really love being out in these spaces, and it's what really got me connected to this. I then went out to Yosemite after that. I was a park ranger, and so I worked a little bit for Yosemite Institute, which is like an environmental ed organization. But I found that when I was there, I was really interested in this concept of how is it that you have 4.2 million people a year in a place like Yosemite, and how do you protect it over time? And what I found as an environmental ed is that, wow, it's the rangers who are doing so much of this work, getting out and talking to people. And I know I've told this story a bunch, but I'll tell you here. One day I was walking down the trail, bumped into this guy. He's doing a study out there. He says he's from University of Vermont. He says his name, like, oh yeah, I know your stuff. I worked in that ESF. I had read some of his stuff. His name is Bob Manning. He said, I'm a professor at the School of Natural Resources. That turned into a lengthy conversation about how and where we should be doing studies in the park. And that turned into an invitation to come to a PhD at School of Natural Resources. And so a year later, I found myself back here in Burlington. It was 25 years ago this year, I think, this summer. And we started really tackling some of these issues. And these issues are about impact. It's about working with people to understand the impacts we make in these spaces, understanding that there are, Michelle and I walked yesterday and talked about like the amazing benefits that people get from these spaces, but how do we actually protect those spaces? That's the big balance we're constantly dealing with. I always like this picture because I feel like that's the conversation, right? These are the impacts, but we love this place. How do we keep balancing these things? And it's balancing because it's a lot of people. Parks are seeing 330 million people a year going to them. Most of those are in the top most popular parks, the ones you've heard of, right? That is not evenly distributed over the 400 plus sites across the country. It's all within a few sites. And that's true with recreation use in general. It's concentrated. It's always concentrated. People want to see the same types of things overall. And when you do have impact, you do have people, these are the kinds of impacts you get. This is a campsite in Wild Canyon that as a ranger, I would bang my head over. You would try to fix these places, but you couldn't keep people away. Anyone ever climb Half Dome? Half Dome is a, you climb Half Dome, you climb the cable route. Oh, you climb the backside, Snake Dike. So this is the cable route where it's not as technical. You just climb up their cables. And this is a great example of this concept of wilderness where there's not a ton of impact people are going to make on granite. But think about the experiential pieces of this. At what point does this become like not fun anymore, not wilderness, loses those characteristics, loses characteristics of solitude, has issues with safety? The project we did here was looking at the number of people going outside the cables, and we were actually able to show, unfortunately, that the larger accidents were happening when people were waiting and standing there on these 2x4s. People were outside the cables, people were falling. This just happened about a month ago, unfortunately, as well. So these are the kinds of challenges we're dealing with. And the funny thing is, these are not new challenges. I found this amazing Frederick Law Olmsted landscape architect who actually designed Central Park among many other parks, had this quote: before many years, if proper facilities are offered, hundreds will become thousands, and in a century, the whole numbers will be counted by millions. And injuries so slight, it'll be unheeded by any visitor, will now be multiplied by millions. That's it. That's like, I would say, if you were to say, what's my research program? It's that. It's these little impacts times millions, right? That then creates these larger impacts, some of them irreparable. But this, he said this in 1865, which is kind of amazing to think about. You know, who would have thought that we'd have that many people in our parks? And this really launched this concept in a sense of visitor capacity, this is what Bob was really excited about. Bob Manning studied a lot of this visitor capacity and had a lab that we all worked in. And it came out of wildlife, right? So it's a concept that really started in wildlife, the maximum number of species that a habitat can sustain indefinitely. That was Sumner, 1930s. Sumner, 1941, shifted a little bit. How large a crowd can be turned loose in a wilderness without destroying its essential qualities, right? This is the concept that says, wait a second, people are a part of this concept. At what point are we destroying these essential qualities? And then the question is, well, what are those qualities, right? And who decides what those qualities are? And that's the hard part of some of the social science stuff that we started to look at. So Wagar, 1964, from Colorado, from Fort Collins, Wagar was, just saying that. So how much and at what types of use can be sustained in an area before the very experience people are seeking are unacceptably degraded, right? Another interesting piece of this. So you're seeing this progression of visitor capacity, right? And it's now has people involved. And it's this point, at what point are we having too much use where it's unacceptably degraded? The question here is unacceptable to who, right? So another big question that we have in all these. All right, so all those are questions that were questions we were working on here in the Park Studies Lab with Bob. Then from there, I went off to Colorado State, became a professor out there, and started diving into these. And we created a similar kind of program called the Protected Areas Research Collaborative, which since 2002, I've worked, well, Derek Tapp is a professor at Penn State. He was at Colorado State as well. This is a group that we ran together at Penn State for about 11 years and years before that at Colorado State. And we do work in visitor capacity, acoustic science, dark skies, integrated visitor use and transportation, education and messaging, and coupled human natural systems. And in a sense, it was that order that we really kind of started to work on these things. When we first started doing this work, it was a lot about visitor management, and it was a lot about thinking about crowding. And it was a lot about understanding how many people are on trails and some of those impacts. What's come from that is looking at all the associated impacts of people moving through wild spaces, because there are a lot of them. And today what I'm going to focus on is some of those acoustic impacts, but we really do look at light, we look at acoustics, we look at other kinds of conflict, how people are connecting. One of my favorite things about this whole research program is this list of people right here, which have been our postdocs and our PhD students. And one of the coolest things is seeing all of them returning to Park Service, returning to the parks, who are now running these programs out there and really taking the science right to the ground into the units, which I think is super, super important. And what they're all steeped in is really this concept. And this is so simple, right? This is, you know, the concept of visitor use and management in parks. You start with management objectives. Those are your broad narrative values of a place. That's the thing that you're protecting. You come up with indicators that are representative of those management objectives. Then you come up with numerical standards that say, here's the point at which we need to draw a line and take a management action. And then at that point, you take the management action and you monitor and you see if it's working. And you go back to your objectives, say, are we meeting our objectives? And it should never end. This is a learning process, right? This is a process. This is a funny thing, is that this is a process that we use all the time. When you're sick, right? If your objective is human health, what's a great indicator? Body temperature. Body temperature is your indicator. 98.6 is your standard. It's above 98.6, you take management action. Is it rest? Do I see a doctor? Do I take Advil? Do I take antibiotics? What is the thing? You monitor, and then you make sure that you're back to where you need to be. This is human health. This is what we do in parks. And this is a learning approach. I think actually organizations could do this too, right? This is literally how we think about growth and learning and creating learning organizations all the time. So one of the areas that has really stood out over time is the acoustic impacts of people. I loved, was that, go and put out a tweet or something. What did it say? It said something like, people are loud. That was great. It's so true. We are loud. We are so loud. And so we can really begin to think about what is that effect in all these places, because it affects not only other people, but it affects wildlife. And the thing I love about acoustics, as I'm learning, and I'm going to talk about some of the very early studies we did in there, is that in acoustics, it's whether you're a human or you're a mouse, it's the sound. The sound is affecting us in similar ways. It's physics. It's vibrations that are going in the air. It's the ability to get an understanding of the signal to noise ratio, trying to hear what is around you and interpret what is that thing, right? And so we're going to talk about that in a second. What we also know about sounds is that they're super, super important to people and to visitor experiences in parks. We know that 90% plus people who visit parks say sound is one of the most compelling reasons to visit a park. They love nature sounds. How many people here go to sleep with some kind of nature sound on Spotify? You do. What do you listen to?
I listen to like the wave, like little waves crashing and crickets.
Crickets and waves, nice. So these are things that we know are generally soothing, not to everyone, but generally they are. Nature sounds tend to be soothing, and we know that from a lot of different, well, we know that because it's pretty intuitive, but we know that because of how many people download those things, because of the billion-dollar industry in these things. We know that human-caused noise, loud voices, vehicles, airplanes, are linked to negative resource and social impact. So negative impacts on the environment, negative impacts on humans, and there's a lot of research on that. Parks set aside sounds like they do air and water. It is protected like air and water. And so thinking about the importance of nature sounds, Park Service has long said this is more important than we think, and we need to really begin to focus on these things. They created a Natural Sounds and Night Skies division in the early 2000s. The timing was kind of funny. I just finished up at Vermont. We had just finished a study at Muir Woods that I'm going to talk about in a second. And I arrived in Fort Collins, Carriagevenia, right? So this new office was created, and they were focused on overflights and aircraft. And we said, that's interesting. We're finding that our studies, people are saying it's not the crowding that's bothering them, it's the sound of these places that's bothering them. And so we started working together, and we've been working together ever since on these things. And you can see it. So this is a spectrogram. A spectrogram is a measure of sound. It's basically taking acoustics and sound and plotting it in data. And so time goes from let's see, was it your left to right, right? And then frequency is the vertical axis, and then brightness is the amplitude. It's the intensity of that sound. And so this is during COVID in Grand Teton National Park. This is with visitors and without visitors, right? And kind of not too far from headquarters there. It makes a difference. There are base level sounds that you can say, here's the natural ambient of a place, and here's all the other human noise that we're creating. But the question is, what is that impact? We're seeing that, let's see, you told me how to do this. There it is. So this is a 24-hour period of all flights in and out of the US. So think about this. This is early morning now. You're waking up, all the flights are coming in from Europe, and literally every day it is that, right? And you think about the blank space on a map, there's very few, right? There's kind of some in the West. These are actually Air Force bases where they keep the UFOs, I think. But this is kind of like Air Force bases literally over here that have restricted. Amazingly, military flyover areas are actually, military's been a pretty good partner with the national parks, and where there's a lot of military flyovers, there's actually less air traffic. People from Burlington say, yeah, but I now are really bad. So it comes from the air, it comes from the ground. So this is an interesting map that shows everything in that dark green and blue. 60 to 100% of that watershed is within 382 meters of a road. Think about that for a second, right? There's barely a spot where we can get away from roads, so air and from ground, it's everywhere. And so these have other kinds of impacts, right? I mean, you think about the F-35, right? And then you're like, oh man, that's really loud. I'm gonna pause when I'm talking. Think if you are a fox, and think if you're in Yellowstone and there's aircraft passing over, but you're trying to find your food, right? Think about the importance of sound as it plays in survival for wildlife, as it plays in communication with young. How about in mating and hearing others, right? All of these things are absolutely effective in the acoustic environment. And it's that moment, right, where it's like, I could just hit stop and walk away, because you understand the importance of how did this fox actually hear a vole, under 3-4 feet of snow, right? And think about the competition with other ambient sound out there. And so these are things that we think about that brings stress. It brings stress and fitness questions to wildlife biology. It brings stress and fitness questions to people, because what we have is a very similar thing. We are surrounded every day by this continuous amount of noise all the time, right? And some of that is wanted and some of that is unwanted. What we're trying to figure out now is thinking about these connections, not only for parks, but for how does this affect human health in general as well. So we've been looking at nature sounds and trying to do studies to understand how do different kinds of sounds affect the perception of aesthetics, right? If something looks beautiful, if it sounds bad, does that affect beauty? We'll tell you in a second. We know about cognitive restoration, right? If you're really tired from doing a whole lot of stuff in a long day, quiet and nature sounds work a whole lot better in restoration than lots of loud sounds that are coming at you from different places. We know that it improves mood. Nature sounds improve mood. We know it promotes stress recovery. These are all things that we're beginning to learn more and more, and we're now partnering with, we did at Penn State, partnered with folks in the College of Medicine to begin to look at how do nature sounds affect the amount of hormones released in the body versus anthropogenic noises. And we're getting some data on that as well. All this comes back to this concept of listening area, which is that there's a dome around all of us that we can hear a certain distance. And that dome is constantly fluctuating. Think the dome, when it's really quiet, is really big. And then when that F-35 passes over, it gets really small and you can barely hear what's next to you. For every 3 decibel increase in sound, there's you basically cut that space in half, right? And so only 3 decibel change is a really big change, because it's kind of logarithmic. We know that parks work. This is a sound and acoustics map of the US, and this is something that is developed by the National Park Service. If you look, the parks are absolutely, they're the darkest colors here. Those are the quietest spots. You can see the cities that are all lighting up. But the Adirondacks really stands out. It's kind of amazing to see how parks do work. And that makes sense. Fewer roads, fewer people, right? But there are these different kinds of problems. So we've been working, we first started working in Muir Woods. We worked in Rocky, Denali, Sequoia, Yosemite, Bandelier, Grand Teton, Mount Rainier. Our first place we worked was Muir Woods. Muir Woods is just to the north of San Francisco. Has anyone ever been to Muir Woods? The redwoods, they're beautiful. And in Muir Woods, you're walking along. We were doing a crowding study there. That was with Bob, my final year of my PhD. We're doing a crowding study there. That then extended into my first year as an assistant professor. And it was on crowding. And all these handwritten notes came in that said, not crowding, that's the issue. It's that it's loud. And so we said, oh, that's interesting. What if we did just kind of a side survey that had people sit and listen and tell us what they're hearing and rate those sounds overall. So it was very, very simple. I was kind of thinking, is this social, is this even science, what we're doing here? So we were really trying, but we set out a great spot for people to sit and listen. And there was a few things that came from it that were really cool. One is people marked certain things they heard, and they started writing certain things down that were associated with certain sounds. And they would then rate these things. So if you were to take the data and literally just plot them, percentage of people who heard certain sounds and how they rated them, you see in the top left, we have people, right? Group talking, unknown group talking, then loud children, group activities, voices. We said to the park, you know, interesting, on the right side, those are your nature sounds. People loved hearing them, people are hearing them, people want to hear more bird chatter, but under 50% are hearing them. How do we change how this looks? And part of that could be, what if we reduce the amount of sound made by people? And so we started thinking about messaging. So we said, okay, well, let's take our whole process here. Management objective is to look at the significance, you know, in this case, it was quiet in this space. What are some indicators? We use percent time human noise is audible to do that. And we actually had this Bob in our makeshift lab, which is a bathroom. And so in this, very similar to some of the work he'd done before, picture, I can't play it right now, but picture the sound clip one was basically base level nature sounds. And then we overlaid numbers of people on those other clips. So people would listen, and then they would mark at the point at which it would really go below acceptability. This is an old way. This is like an old way that we did the norm stuff, which wasn't awesome. We're now doing more regression and really controlling for a whole bunch of different things, but that's a whole other talk. This is just conceptual, but this is what happened. It went below acceptability, which is at about 37 decibels, which makes sense in our later research, but again, that's another talk. So we now know, we knew from what people are saying, after 37 decibels of human-made noise, people would say this condition is not good. So then we tried a few different treatments, and we started to think about where are people quiet? Thought libraries are one of those places, right? Has anyone ever been shushed in a library? You admit it, that's good. And so it happens, you're in a library, you're in the quiet zone, and you make noise, and someone does that, right? They give you the international sound of please be quiet. And so we said, let's tap into that urge. And so we started making quiet zones. And we said, you're coming up to a quiet zone, and then when you hit Cathedral Grove, you're in a quiet zone. Please refrain from talking. We had these signs set up, and we actually did this with microphones then in the woods, measuring the amount of sound that was out there. And we set this up over 30 days, total experimental design. Those treatments were assigned on random days. On control days, there were no signs, nothing in place. And so when you looked at what happened, on the days where treatments were in effect, and it was particularly the quiet zone, we were able to lower the amount of ambient noise by 3 decibels in the woods. So we were able to really lower, which basically, remember what we said before, that doubles the listening area. And it's the equivalent of removing 1,150 people without removing them, right? Another thing to learn about visitor capacity is it's not just about a number, it's about behavior, right? And again, similar to sustainability, right? It's not always about the number, it's about how we're in a place, how we interact. So we found that quiet zone was pretty effective. If you went to Cathedral Grove, you probably saw that, well, you may have noticed there are quiet zones now that came from this. So that was years ago. 10 years later, we said, let's go do that experiment again. But this time, let's do it, see if we can replicate it, because I think we need to do more of that stuff. And second is that we want to go with our wildlife biologist colleagues and say, okay, what happens when we turn the volume of people up and down? Does it affect wildlife? That's basically the question. And it got us thinking about this is a great example of a public human natural system. When you shift behaviors of people, does it shift the behavior of wildlife? And does that shift how people perceive the environment, right? This became a proposal to NSF. It was in the Chan's days, the couple of human natural systems proposals. And so we went there with Jesse Barber, who is a team of bioacousticians out of Boise State University. We replicated the whole project. So everything you remember, we did the same thing. We put out different acoustic monitors, and it was 10 years later, so we actually had better acoustic monitors, which was good, and we had more of them out there. And I'm going to jump right to the punchline here. So we ran the survey, and what ended up happening was we basically on days when the treatment was in place, when there was a quiet zone, when people were quieter, the bird chorus started earlier in the day. When people were louder, the bird chorus started later in the day. So wildlife basically said, we're not competing with you people, right? We are not going to compete with that. And so there was a full-on shift in some of the wildlife behavior as it related to the human behavior. And it really made us realize, really think about the important synthetic side of what we're doing. It synthesizes both the human behavior with wildlife behavior, and something we really need to begin to think more and more about. Let's see, I know the time. Okay, so what have we learned? One is recreation planning. Capacity is a process. It's not always a product. It's not just a number, and it should be adaptive. And it's got to be adaptive about how we think about these things and who's involved. It should consider, as we think about visitor capacity, it should consider more broadly all these considerations of linkages among activities, settings, experiences, and benefits that people all try to accrue when they're going to these places. And it's super important to provide this diversity of experiences. But more importantly, we need to think about how do park soundscapes influence health and human well-being? Because I think this is something I'm so excited about to work with folks from GUND, is to think about how do we think about acoustics and the acoustics experiences that people have as cultural ecosystem services, as a service provided by ecosystems. What do sounds do? And this is the discussion I'm hoping to have, because I feel like I need to learn. I'm excited to work with you. I need to learn more about the whole ecosystem services framework. All right, so we've started doing some of these studies. One was having people in a lab look at different photos and evaluate their aesthetic quality of these photos. And in some of the times we would play just nature sounds, and in some of the times we play nature sounds with aircraft flying over every once in a while. And they would hear that. Anyway, the aesthetic value of photos were actually 30% lower when you put nature sounds involved. So things aren't just what you see. Things are, we think of beauty, that tends to have an acoustic component to it. That was a piece we learned. We tried to do something where we actually went through IRB on this. We stressed people out by giving them something. They said you had to come up with a 5-minute speech. Here are some notes. And then we pulled their notes away. Sorry, I can't use notes. And then they'd have to give it to a mirror, and we told them there was a professor behind the mirror. It actually worked really well. So people's heart rate would increase. And then we provided, this is all went through IRB. And then they had different treatments afterwards. And some of those were just nature sounds, and some of them are nature sounds interlaced with aircraft noise. And what we were finding, and we're still going through these data now, is that there were the rate of restoration was much higher and faster in a natural environment. I mean, that kind of makes a lot of sense. We then also tried to reverse this. We went out to Boulder, because the Park Service won't let us do this, and we put speakers in the woods. We set up a whole speaker array, and the speaker array was set up to provide birds, right? So you're hiking, and oh, you see birds. They were our speakers playing birds. But we asked people about their perception of that experience and then how they felt about it. And in the end, biodiversity and perception of biodiversity and perception of bird calls were linked very much to how people felt about that experience, and then measures of their own well-being before and after their hike. We know that these places are important. During COVID, there was a huge surge in people going to the outdoors, and we did a panel. We couldn't get out to the park, so we got a panel of data, and we looked at who was returning to the parks and what percentage of people wanted to see the parks message better in order to return to the parks. And so we did see this huge surge in people who were seeking recreation opportunities both near their house, but then also going to public lands. And that surge was recognized by the Park Service as well. And this was something that people really talked about, the important psychological factors of going to these places. But what ended up happening in COVID is those gains were generally from white, upper middle class populations. And there was a big loss in terms of the diversity. And so Park Service, they had a big push for a while saying, find your parks, and they were doing much better. We all, I would just say, took steps back during COVID in terms of access to these public spaces. And thinking about that is a health disparity and something that we need to really think about in these for parks. Let's see, that was short distances. So what does this all mean? When I was leaving Penn State, we just started this new acoustics lab. And this acoustics lab is funded by the National Park Service. It's possible it may shift to UVM. We're still trying to figure that out. But we worked really directly with the National Park Service. They have 70 different parks that are doing recordings across the country. And in a little basement at Penn State, we have students working at those computers who are looking at spectrograms and listening to clips and identifying every sound heard on those recordings across the 70 parks. And you think, why are we doing that? We're doing that because we need to get base level sounds of these parks to understand change. And I do think that the acoustic environment is one of those great indicators of understanding how population is affecting these protected areas and parks. And so we're beginning to understand what those are. The cool thing about this project is that we're working with the acoustics program at Penn State, who we have a Ph.D. student who actually is working on an algorithm, so using AI to basically take the students out of this, right? So right now we're doing the listening, we're feeding the AI algorithm, the algorithm is learning, and in a few years, that algorithm should be good enough. I know that Cornell has this with birds. This is across anthropogenic noise, right? And so this would then provide an algorithm to really begin to understand what are these noises, and then how can you then take that amount of data and rapidly do these inventories overall. And so this will provide us over time a big shift in understanding how is the acoustic environment changing over time. So what does it tell us? Biodiversity and intact systems should really be thinking about the acoustic environment. And I really think as we think about ecosystems, we need to better understand our acoustic impact. We need to come up with monitoring to understand how we are affecting those spaces, and understand that it affects humans in a big way in terms of our health. And we can all probably, relate to that. One of the things that I think is super important and that I want to talk more about is understanding how parks can be part of a national discussion on public health, right? During COVID, we know that people were seeking these experiences. They were trying to get out of the house. They were using local parks, they're using neighborhood parks. But we need to understand, how do we talk more broadly about the importance of these spaces in the public health standpoint? Because I feel like parks we think of tourism, we think of all these different policy things, and parks get funded last, right? When you shift it to ecosystem services and we think about the importance of parks in terms of maintaining nutrient systems, maintaining healthy watersheds, maintaining public health, we shift things in a different way. And this is something that I'm really excited to bring here for that discussion. Just think about how can sounds become a part of that overall thing, to think about it from a policy lens. So I think that's an important piece of this, is how do there's enough data out there from a health standpoint, and there's enough data out there from the nationwide measurement of acoustics across the landscape, and there's enough data out there on how this all affects wildlife to say that the data are there. We now need to think about the policy implications. We're actually doing the same thing with light right now. If you have visited Grand Teton National Park, you may have visited Coulter Bay. Have you been to Coulter Bay? See the red lights in the parking lot? Did you see those? Those are ours. So we put those up. Those were, we got permission to change out all the light bulbs in Coulter Bay, to change them to red and amber away from white light. And the reason is that what we know is, one, it absolutely affects the experience, but we also are learning more and more. And I say we, Jesse Barber, this is my colleague in wildlife, doing all these measures of how much these areas are pulling in insects from the region, right? And so think of a parking lot with white light flaring, and how for miles insects attracted to that light. What does that affect? That then affects bird populations days later, right? And so there is a temporal impact of light at night. Light's cool because you just switch it off or you change the color. Sound is cool because we can quiet ourselves generally, right? And so these are all changes we can make that do have an immediate impact and do change things. And from some of the science, social science we're doing, people get it and they notice and they like the improvements. Oh, a shift in behavior means a change in the condition. That's something that's valuable is for people to think about, because that's what we're trying to do really with climate change, right? How do we shift behavior in order to shift an outcome? Climate change is harder because people don't quite get what that means, I think, sometimes. Light and sound. So I will stop there. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm probably over.
Yeah.
That's it. It's your interesting papers. I did this like a Google Scholar code there. You can check out some papers. Thank you.